The boy who whispered, "Help me." The late afternoon sky burned with hues of orange and crimson, casting long shadows over the bustling downtown streets. Officer Naomi Bennett adjusted her patrol cap, her boots crunching against the pavement as she exited her cruiser. The air was heavy with the hum of distant traffic, mingling with the occasional chatter of pedestrians. Her radio crackled to life, pulling her attention back to the matter at hand. Unit 17, report of a young child wandering alone near the park on Birchwood Avenue. No guardian in sight. Please investigate. Naomi acknowledged the call, her voice calm but firm. Another welfare check, routine, or so she thought. Yet, as she turned onto Birchwood, a strange sense of unease crept up her spine, unshakable and unexplained. When she arrived, she scanned the area, her sharp eyes sweeping over the park. Then she saw him. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. He stood near the edge of the sidewalk, clutching something tightly to his chest. His small frame seemed almost lost in an oversized, tattered hoodie that hung off him like a shadow. His hair was unkempt, and his sneakers, if you could still call them that, were worn down to thin soles. Naomi's heart twisted. She'd seen countless cases of children in trouble, but there was something different about this one. She approached him slowly, keeping her tone light. "Hey there, buddy. Are you lost?" The boy turned to look at her, and Naomi felt a jolt. His wide, fearful eyes locked onto hers, a mixture of desperation and relief flooding his gaze. Then, without warning, he darted toward her, nearly tripping over his own feet. Naomi crouched instinctively to catch him as he stumbled, her hand steadying his fragile shoulders. "Whoa, it's okay," she said softly, her voice calm despite the storm of questions brewing in her mind. "You're safe now. What's your name?" The boy looked up at her, tears welling in his eyes. His voice was barely above a whisper as he spoke 2 simple words. "Help me." Naomi froze. The raw fear in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "Of course I'll help you," she said gently, doing her best to mask the worry bubbling under her calm exterior. "Can you tell me where your parents are, or where you live?" He shook his head violently, clutching the object in his arms even tighter. Naomi noticed it was a folded piece of paper, creased from being held too often. "I can't go back there," he mumbled, his voice trembling. "Go back where?" Naomi pressed, but the boy flinched as if the words themselves hurt. He looked around nervously, his gaze darting to the shadows like he was expecting someone, or something, to appear. Naomi softened her voice further. "It's okay. No one's going to hurt you. You're safe with me. I promise." The boy hesitated, his grip on the paper loosening just slightly. Slowly, Naomi reached out. "Can I see what you're holding?" He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face as though trying to decide whether to trust her. Finally, with trembling hands, he handed her the paper. Naomi unfolded it carefully, her breath catching the moment her eyes landed on the image. It was a photograph, slightly faded but unmistakable. A woman in a police uniform smiled back at her, her badge gleaming under the sunlight captured in the photo. Naomi's stomach dropped. The woman was her. The photograph was of her, taken years ago when she had first joined the force. Her younger self looked back at her with a radiant smile, the kind she hadn't worn in a long time. Naomi's throat tightened. She glanced back at the boy, who was watching her closely, as if waiting for her reaction. Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Carla gave it to me," the boy said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "She told me to keep it safe. She said, you're my mom." The world seemed to tilt beneath Naomi's feet. Her mind raced as she tried to process his words. Her mom. This had to be a mistake. She didn't have children. She couldn't have children, not after the heartbreak she'd endured years ago. The loss had nearly broken her, leaving behind scars she thought she'd buried. But now this boy was here, clutching a photograph of her younger self, claiming she was his mother. Naomi's voice was soft but firm as she spoke again. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Daniel," he whispered. "Okay, Daniel," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "Let's figure this out together. I'm going to take you somewhere safe, okay?" He nodded, his small hand reaching out to grasp hers tightly, as though letting go wasn't an option. Naomi led him to her cruiser, her mind reeling. She buckled him into the passenger seat and handed him a bottle of water she kept in the glove compartment. "Drink this," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It'll help you feel better." As she started the engine, Naomi glanced at him again. He was staring out the window, clutching the photograph once more. The photograph of her. The drive to the precinct felt longer than usual, every passing moment filled with unanswered questions. Who was Daniel? Where had he come from? And how had he ended up with a photograph of her? Naomi's instincts told her there was more to this than she could see. The fear in Daniel's eyes, the way he clung to her as though she were his lifeline. It all pointed to something bigger. When they arrived at the station, Naomi brought Daniel to a quiet corner in the break room. She handed him a granola bar and a cup of hot cocoa, trying to make him feel at ease. "Here you go," she said with a smile. "Eat up. You must be hungry." Daniel took the granola bar, but didn't eat it right away. He just held it, his small hands trembling slightly. "Daniel," Naomi began, crouching to meet his gaze. "I need you to tell me everything you remember. Can you do that for me?" He hesitated, his eyes filling with tears again. "I don't know. I don't remember much," he admitted. "That's okay," Naomi said softly. "Just tell me what you can." He sniffled, his voice shaky as he began to speak. "Miss Carla, she told me to find you. She said you'd keep me safe, but the others didn't want me to leave. They were mean to me. They locked me in my room." Naomi's jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "Who were they, Daniel? The people who locked you up?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know their names," he said, his voice barely audible. Naomi placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. We'll figure this out. I promise you." As she stood, Naomi's mind raced. She needed help, someone who could untangle the mystery surrounding Daniel. Reaching for her phone, she dialed a number she hadn't called in a while. "Lisa Grant," came the voice on the other end. "Lisa, it's Naomi," she said, her tone urgent. "I've got a situation. A boy named Daniel. I think we need to dig deeper into his past. Can you meet me at the station?" "Of course," Lisa replied without hesitation. "I'll be there within the hour." Naomi hung up and glanced back at Daniel, who had finally started nibbling on the granola bar. She didn't know how, but she was certain of one thing. This wasn't just a routine case. This was the beginning of something far bigger than she could have imagined. Whispers from the past. Naomi sat in the quiet precinct office, her thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. The boy Daniel sat a few feet away, nibbling cautiously on the granola bar she had given him. His fragile form made her chest ache with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Was it protectiveness? Anger? Guilt? Lisa Grant arrived exactly 45 minutes later, her no-nonsense demeanor tempered by the kind smile Naomi had come to rely on in cases like these. Lisa was the social worker Naomi trusted the most, the one person who could unravel complicated situations with a mixture of compassion and sharp insight. "Naomi," Lisa greeted, stepping into the room and scanning the scene. Her eyes lingered on Daniel before she leaned in closer to whisper, "What have we got here?" "Something strange," Naomi admitted, gesturing for Lisa to sit. She kept her voice low. "Daniel says his name is Daniel. He's terrified, Lisa. He says he can't go back to where he came from. Something about being locked in his room and people who didn't want him to leave." Lisa's face hardened, the lines around her mouth deepening. "That's already alarming enough. Is that all he said so far?" Naomi shook her head, then slid the photograph across the table. "This is where it gets strange. He says this is his mom." Her voice faltered as she gestured to the faded image. Lisa picked up the photograph, her brow furrowing. Her eyes flickered between the photo and Naomi. "Wait, is this you?" "Yes," Naomi replied, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her shoulders again. "That's me. This photo was taken about 8 or 9 years ago, but I've never seen it before." Lisa's jaw tightened as she set the photograph down. "Naomi, you don't have a son. At least, not that I know of." "I don't," Naomi said firmly, though the words felt heavy in her throat. She hesitated before continuing. "But there's something I've never told anyone. Years ago, I was pregnant. It was unexpected, and I was alone. I went into labor early, and the doctors said there were complications. They told me." Her voice broke, and she had to steady herself before continuing. "They told me the baby didn't make it." Lisa's expression softened with sympathy. "Naomi, are you saying you think Daniel could be your child?" Naomi hesitated. The very idea felt impossible, implausible, but every instinct she had as a cop and as a human being was screaming that something was wrong. "I don't know what I'm saying, Lisa, but I can't ignore the possibility." Lisa nodded, her professionalism taking over. "We need to follow the trail then. Start with the basics. Daniel's full file, his placement history, any records Bright Futures had on him. Something doesn't add up, and we need to figure out what it is." Naomi exhaled, grateful for Lisa's steady presence. "Thank you." Lisa turned her attention to Daniel, crouching down to meet him at eye level. "Hi, Daniel. My name's Lisa. I work with kids who need a little extra help. Do you think we can talk for a bit?" Daniel hesitated, glancing nervously at Naomi. She gave him an encouraging nod. "It's okay, Daniel. Lisa's here to help." The boy nodded reluctantly. "Okay." Lisa smiled gently. "Can you tell me about where you were before Naomi found you? Who took care of you?" Daniel's small hands fidgeted with the hem of his hoodie. "The people in the big house," he murmured. "The Mitchells. They're not nice. They lock the door at night, and they don't talk to me. They said I'm too much trouble." Naomi clenched her jaw, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. Lisa placed a soothing hand on her arm, silently urging her to keep her composure. "And before the Mitchells?" Lisa pressed. Daniel shook his head. "I don't remember much. Just Miss Carla. She was nice. She gave me the picture and told me to keep it safe." Lisa exchanged a look with Naomi. "Miss Carla. She was the only one who was nice to me," Daniel continued. "She told me to find my real mom one day." "Thank you, Daniel," Lisa said softly. "You've been very brave." As Lisa stood, Naomi whispered, "Can we track down this Carla?" Lisa nodded. "I'll start digging. If she was a foster parent, there should be some kind of record." Naomi's stomach twisted. Every revelation felt like another step down a dark, twisting path. But she wasn't going to stop, not until she uncovered the truth. That evening, Naomi brought Daniel home with her. It wasn't standard protocol, but Lisa had agreed it was the best temporary solution. The thought of sending him back to the Mitchells made Naomi's blood boil. Daniel was quiet during the drive, his head resting against the window as he clutched the photograph in his lap. When they arrived, Naomi showed him to her modest apartment, guiding him to the small guest room. "This is your room," she said, turning on the light. "It's not much, but it's yours." Daniel hesitated in the doorway. Can I sleep on the couch instead?" Naomi frowned. "Why the couch?" "I don't like being alone," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Naomi sighed but nodded. "Okay, the couch it is." As Daniel settled in for the night, Naomi sat at her dining table, staring at the photograph once more. The young, smiling version of herself felt like a stranger. She reached for her laptop, her fingers trembling as she typed the name Bright Futures into the search bar. The results were sparse but troubling. Articles about the agency's abrupt shutdown years ago hinted at scandals, mismanagement, financial irregularities, and rumors of unethical practices. But nothing concrete, Nothing that explained how Daniel had come into their system or why he had a photograph of her. Her mind drifted back to the hospital 8 years ago. The memory of that day was a blur. Pain, exhaustion, and the doctor's sympathetic voice as he told her the baby hadn't survived. But now, cracks were forming in that memory, little details that didn't sit right. The rushed paperwork, the way the nurse had avoided meeting her eyes, the strange sense of finality, as though they wanted her to leave and forget. Naomi shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She needed answers, and she knew where to start. The next morning, Naomi called Marcus Lee, a trusted friend and fellow officer who had a knack for digging up information others couldn't. When she explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. "Bring me the photograph," Marcus said. "I'll see what I can find." Naomi met him at the precinct, handing over the worn photograph. Marcus studied it carefully, his analytical mind already at work. "This is definitely you," he said, pointing to the badge number on her uniform. "And it's not a fake. That's your old ID number. I'll run it through the system, see if I can trace when and where it was taken." "Thanks, Marcus," Naomi said, her voice tight. "I owe you." As she left the precinct, her phone buzzed with a call from Lisa. "I found her," Lisa said without preamble. "Miss Carla. Her full name is Carla Jenkins. She used to be a licensed foster parent, but her license was revoked about 5 years ago." "Why?" Naomi asked. "Neglect," Lisa replied, though her tone suggested skepticism. "At least, that's what the official report says. But it doesn't add up. The complaints came shortly after she filed a report against Bright Futures. My guess, they blacklisted her." Naomi's grip on the phone tightened. "Where is she now?" "She's been off the radar for a while," Lisa admitted. "But I think I've tracked her down. She's living in a small town about 3 hours from here." Naomi's heart raced. "Send me the address." Lisa hesitated. "Naomi, are you sure about this? If Bright Futures silenced her once, they won't hesitate to do it again." "I have to do this," Naomi said firmly. "For Daniel. For the truth." The drive to the small town was quiet, the road winding through dense forests and open fields. Daniel sat in the back seat, clutching the photograph as though it were a lifeline. Naomi glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what they would find, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. When they arrived, the town was just as Lisa had described. Small, unassuming, and quiet. Naomi parked in front of a modest house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. She turned to Daniel, her voice soft. "Are you ready, Daniel?" He nodded, his small hand reaching for hers as they stepped out of the car. Naomi led him to the front door, her heart pounding as she knocked. Moments later, the door creaked open, and a woman's face appeared. Her hair was streaked with gray, her eyes sharp but weary. She froze when her gaze landed on Daniel, her hand flying to her mouth. "Miss Carla?" Naomi asked. The woman's voice trembled as she whispered, "You kept the picture." Daniel's face lit up, a shy smile spreading across his lips. "Miss Carla." Secrets buried deep. Carla Jenkins stood frozen in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted between Naomi and Daniel, who was already stepping forward, his small frame trembling with barely contained excitement. "Miss Carla." Daniel's voice was filled with a rare joy, a tone Naomi hadn't heard from him before. It was as if seeing this woman brought him a sense of safety he hadn't felt in years. Carla's eyes brimmed with tears as she crouched down, opening her arms wide. "Oh, my sweet boy," she whispered, her voice cracking. Daniel rushed into her embrace, clutching her tightly. For a moment, they stayed like that, locked in a reunion that Naomi couldn't bring herself to interrupt. Finally, Carla looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with confusion and something else. Recognition. Her gaze lingered on Naomi, then shifted to the photograph Daniel still held in his hand. "You're her," Carla said softly, rising to her feet. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her turmoil. "The woman in the picture." I never thought. She trailed off, shaking her head as though trying to piece together a puzzle that had eluded her for years. Yes, Naomi replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. I'm the woman in the photo. And I need to know how this all connects. What happened to Daniel? How did he end up with you? Why does he have a picture of me? Carla's lips trembled as she opened the door wider, gesturing for them to come inside. You'd better sit down, she said, her voice heavy with resignation. This is going to take some explaining. The inside of Carla's home was modest but warm, filled with mismatched furniture and the faint smell of lavender. Naomi noticed an old patchwork quilt draped over the back of a worn couch and framed photographs of children scattered across the walls and shelves. Children who, Naomi guessed, were all foster kids Carla had cared for over the years. Carla motioned for Naomi to take a seat at the small dining table while Daniel curled up on the couch, the photograph still clutched in his small hands. Carla busied herself with making tea, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were buying time to gather her thoughts. When she finally sat down across from Naomi, her hands shook as she poured tea into 2 chipped mugs. I don't even know where to start, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Start with Daniel, Naomi said gently. How did he come into your care? Carla nodded, taking a deep breath. About 7 years ago, I got a call from Bright Futures. They told me they had a baby boy who needed a home. No details, no background, just a quick placement. That wasn't unusual for them. They were always rushing things, never giving us the full story. Naomi leaned forward, her heart pounding. And they gave you Daniel. Carla's eyes softened as she glanced toward the boy on the couch. Yes, he was just a baby when he came to me, barely a few months old. He was the sweetest little thing, always quiet but alert, like he was taking in everything around him. Carla hesitated, her expression darkening. But even then, I knew something wasn't right. Bright Futures didn't give me any medical records or a birth certificate, just a file with his first name and a few vague details. When I asked questions, they'd brushed me off, told me it wasn't my job to dig. Naomi clenched her fists under the table. Why didn't you report them? I tried, Carla said, her voice rising slightly. But Bright Futures had connections everywhere. Every time I raised concerns, they'd shut me down. Then one day, I noticed a name in Daniel's file, a nurse named Evelyn Porter. She'd scribbled a note in the margins, something about keeping the photo safe. That's when I found it. Carla reached for a worn journal sitting on the edge of the table. She opened it to a page where the photograph had been carefully tucked inside. Evelyn must have slipped it into his file before Bright Futures handed him over. I don't know why, but I kept it. Something about it felt important. Naomi stared at the photograph, her heart aching with the weight of everything Carla was saying. And Miss Porter? Do you know what happened to her? Carla shook her head. She disappeared not long after I found the photo. Some said she retired, but I heard rumors that she'd been silenced. Bright Futures didn't take kindly to people questioning them. Naomi's breath hitched. Silenced. What do you mean? Carla's eyes darkened. I mean they had people everywhere. Judges, doctors, even law enforcement. If you crossed them, you were blacklisted at best. At worst, she trailed off, her meaning clear. Naomi's stomach churned. She had known Bright Futures was corrupt, but the extent of their reach was worse than she had imagined. And then what happened to you? Carla let out a bitter laugh. I kept pushing, asking questions, trying to find out more about Daniel's past. I even confronted Bright Futures directly. A week later, they sent someone to inspect my home. Filed a complaint saying I was neglectful. Within days, they revoked my license and took Daniel away. Naomi's chest tightened with anger. They targeted you. Of course they did, Carla said bitterly. They wanted to make an example of me. But before they took Daniel, I made sure he kept that photograph. I told him, one day you'll find her. She's your real mom." Naomi's voice trembled. "Why did you think I was his mom?" Carla hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "Evelyn told me," she admitted. "She said the woman in the photo was Daniel's biological mother. I didn't know if it was true, but the way Daniel clung to that picture, it felt right. I wanted him to believe he had someone out there who loved him." Naomi swallowed hard, her mind reeling. If what Carla was saying was true, then Daniel was her son, the baby she had been told didn't survive, the baby she had mourned for years. But why would they do this? Naomi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would Bright Futures take my baby?" Carla's expression darkened. "Money," she said simply. "They were running an illegal adoption ring, selling babies to the highest bidder. Vulnerable mothers like you were their easiest targets, single, alone, with no one to fight for you. They made you believe your baby was gone so they could sell him off." Naomi's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the table. The rage building inside her was almost too much to bear. "They took everything from me," she said through clenched teeth. "And they almost destroyed Daniel's life, too." Carla reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Naomi's. "But he's here now," she said softly. "And you found him. That's what matters." Naomi nodded, though her mind was already racing ahead. Bright Futures might have been shut down, but the people behind it were still out there. And she was going to make sure they paid for what they had done. As the evening wore on, Naomi and Carla continued to piece together the fragments of Daniel's story. The journal Carla had kept over the years was filled with notes, timelines, and even a few names of people she suspected were involved in Bright Futures' operation. Naomi took pictures of every page, determined to use the information to build a case. Meanwhile, Daniel had fallen asleep on the couch, the photograph still clutched tightly in his hand. Naomi watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of love and sorrow. He had been through so much, and yet he had survived. He was stronger than she could have ever imagined. Carla placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder, her expression somber. "What are you going to do now?" Naomi's jaw tightened. "I'm going to take this to the precinct," she said. "I have a friend who's good at uncovering hidden connections. We're going to find out who was behind Bright Futures and bring them to justice." Carla nodded, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "If you need me to testify, I will. Whatever it takes to protect Daniel." Naomi gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Carla, for everything." As she prepared to leave, Naomi gently lifted Daniel into her arms, careful not to wake him. He stirred slightly, his head resting against her shoulder. "I'll keep him safe," Naomi promised Carla. "And I'll make sure he knows how much you cared for him." Carla's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "He deserves a chance to be happy. That's all I ever wanted for him." Naomi carried Daniel to the car, her mind already turning over the next steps. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she was ready to face them. For Daniel, for the truth, and for the chance to finally bring the shadows of the past into the light. Shadows closing in. The hum of the car engine filled the silence as Naomi drove through the dark, winding roads leading back to the city. Daniel was fast asleep in the back seat, his small body curled up beneath a blanket Carla had handed her before they left. His face looked peaceful in the soft glow of the dashboard lights, but Naomi couldn't shake the storm of emotions raging inside her. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions and fears. Carla's revelations about Bright Futures and their shadowy operation had shifted everything Naomi thought she knew about her past. Daniel wasn't just a boy she found wandering the streets. He was her son, the child she'd been told was lost forever. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she thought of Bright Futures. How many more children had been stolen? How many more mothers had been lied to, just like her? And how many of the people behind it were still out there, living freely while their victims suffered in silence? Naomi tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her jaw clenching. She wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was Marcus. Marcus, she answered, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Daniel. What did you find? I've been digging through the precinct archives and cross-referencing with the files Carla gave you, Marcus said, his tone brisk and professional. Bright Futures was dirtier than we ever thought. Financial fraud, falsified medical records, payoffs to judges, even connections to organized crime. But here's the kicker. They didn't work alone. Naomi's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Bright Futures had partners, Marcus continued. Hospitals, private adoption agencies, even some law enforcement officials. It was a full-blown network, Naomi. And they didn't just take kids. They erased them, changed names, destroyed birth records, and created entirely new identities for these children before selling them off to families willing to pay top dollar. Naomi's stomach churned. Do you have names? Anyone still active? Marcus hesitated. I'm still piecing that part together, but I found one lead. A man named Richard Langley. He was one of the directors of Bright Futures, and he's still operating under the radar. Looks like he's running a consulting firm now. Consulting being a front for whatever shady business he's into these days. Where is he? Naomi demanded. He's based here in the city, Marcus replied. I've got his address and work location. But Naomi, be careful. If this guy was high up in Bright Futures, he won't go down easily. He probably still has people protecting him. Naomi exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Send me everything you've got on him. I'm going to pay him a visit. Naomi, Marcus warned, his voice low. Don't do this alone. If he's as dangerous as we think, you'll need backup. I'll be fine, Naomi said firmly, though she appreciated his concern. I'll call you when I have more. She ended the call and glanced at Daniel in the rearview mirror. He stirred slightly but remained asleep, his small hand clutching the photograph even in slumber. Naomi's resolve hardened. She would do whatever it took to protect him, even if it meant confronting the demons of her own past. The next morning, Naomi stood outside the precinct, coffee in hand, and a folder of documents tucked under her arm. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale golden light over the city. She barely slept, her mind too restless with the weight of everything she'd learned. Inside, Marcus was waiting for her, his face lined with exhaustion but determined. He gestured for her to follow him into one of the precinct's private conference rooms. I pulled everything I could on Richard Langley, Marcus said, spreading out a series of documents, photographs, and financial records across the table. This guy's been hiding in plain sight for years. He's got connections to private hospitals, legal firms, and even a few politicians. If anyone knows the full extent of Bright Futures' operation, it's him. Naomi scanned the information, her heart pounding. Langley's photograph stared back at her, a sharp-featured man in his late 50s with cold, calculating eyes. What about his current operation? Naomi asked. Marcus pointed to a set of financial records. His consulting firm, Langley Solutions, is listed as a legitimate business, but it's a front. He's been laundering money through shell companies and using the firm to cover up his tracks. He's careful, though, never leaves a direct paper trail. If we're going to take him down, we'll need hard evidence. Naomi nodded, her mind already formulating a plan. Do we have anything on his past ties to Bright Futures? Something we can use to pressure him? Marcus hesitated. There's one name that keeps popping up in connection with him. A doctor named William Corbett. He worked at Riverside Memorial, the same hospital where Daniel was born. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. Corbett was there that day, she said, her voice tight. He's the one who told me my baby didn't survive. Marcus's eyes darkened. Then he's involved. And if we can find him, we might be able to connect the dots between Langley, Bright Futures, and the hospital's role in all of this. Naomi's hands clenched into fists. Where is he now? Corbett retired a few years ago, Marcus said. But I found an address for him. He's living in a gated community, on the outskirts of the city. Naomi nodded. Then he's our next stop. Naomi waited until Lisa arrived to take Daniel into temporary protective custody at the precinct. She hated leaving him, but she knew it was the safest option while she followed this new lead. "I'll keep him safe," Lisa assured her as Daniel clung to her hand. "Just focus on getting the answers we need." Naomi crouched down to Daniel's level, her voice soft. "I'll be back soon. Okay. Lisa's going to take care of you while I'm gone." Daniel nodded, though his eyes were filled with worry. "Will you find the bad people?" Naomi's heart twisted, but she forced a reassuring smile. "I will. I promise." With that, she left the precinct and drove to William Corbett's address, her mind racing with questions and suspicions. The gated community was quiet and pristine, each house a testament to wealth and privilege. Naomi parked outside Corbett's home, a sprawling two-story house with perfectly manicured lawns and an air of cold sterility. She rang the doorbell, her badge visible at her hip. A few moments later, the door opened, and an older man with graying hair and a sharp suit stood before her. "Yes?" he asked, his tone curt. "Dr. William Corbett?" Naomi asked. "That's me," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "Officer Naomi Bennett," she said, holding up her badge. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about your time at Riverside Memorial Hospital." Corbett's expression flickered, just for a moment, before he schooled it back into neutrality. "I haven't worked there in years. I'm not sure how I can help you." Naomi stepped forward, her voice firm. "It's about a child who was placed in the care of Bright Futures. A child who was born at Riverside while you were on staff." Corbett's face paled, his hand tightening on the doorframe. "I don't know anything about that," he said quickly. "Don't lie to me, doctor," Naomi said, her tone sharp. "I was there. 8 years ago. You told me my baby didn't survive. But he did, didn't he? You were part of Bright Futures operation, weren't you?" Corbett stepped back, his eyes darting around as though searching for an escape. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice shaking. Naomi pushed forward, her anger boiling over. "I have enough evidence to tie you to this, so you can either cooperate and tell me everything you know, or I can drag you down to the precinct and make this official." Corbett hesitated, his fear palpable. Finally, he let out a shaky breath. "I didn't have a choice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They threatened me, my career, my family. I did what they told me to do." Naomi's jaw tightened. "And what exactly did they tell you to do?" Corbett's eyes filled with guilt as he answered. "They told me to falsify records, to tell mothers their babies didn't survive so Bright Futures could take them. I didn't know what they were doing at first, but by the time I realized, it was too late. They had too much power." Naomi felt a surge of rage and disgust, but she forced herself to stay focused. "Who gave the orders? Was it Richard Langley?" Corbett nodded slowly. "Langley was in charge of everything. He made sure no one asked questions. If anyone stepped out of line, he trailed off, his meaning clear." Naomi's fists clenched. "You're going to testify," she said, her voice cold. "You're going to help me bring him down." Corbett hesitated, fear flashing in his eyes. "If I do that, they'll come after me." "Not if I get to them first," Naomi said, her voice hard with determination. "The reckoning begins." Naomi left Corbett's house with a knot of anger tightening in her chest. His confession had only confirmed the horrifying extent of Bright Futures' crimes. Babies stolen, lives destroyed, mothers left to grieve for children who were still alive. All for money and power. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she drove away, her mind racing with plans. Richard Langley was the puppet master, the man who had orchestrated it all, and she was going to bring him down. But this wasn't just about justice, it was personal. She pulled into the precinct parking lot, her pulse pounding. Inside, Marcus was waiting for her, already pulling up files on Langley and Corbett. "Did he talk?" Marcus asked as Naomi entered the room, her expression grim. "He talked," Naomi confirmed, dropping into a chair across from him. "Langley's the one pulling the strings." Corbett admitted to falsifying records under Langley's orders, and he's willing to testify. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's a big win. But if Langley's as powerful as we think, we'll need more than Corbett's testimony to take him down." Naomi nodded, her jaw tight. "What about Langley's financials? Any paper trails we can follow?" Marcus leaned back, tapping at his keyboard. "Langley's smart, but he's not perfect. I found a few inconsistencies in his financial records. Payments to shell companies, untraceable transfers, and a handful of transactions tied to offshore accounts. Nothing concrete yet, but it's a start." Naomi's mind was already working through the possibilities. What about his consulting firm? If it's a front, there's got to be something illegal happening there. Marcus smirked. "Funny you mention that. I pulled their business filings. Langley Solutions has a warehouse listed as a storage facility, but according to city records, it hasn't been inspected in years. It's completely off the radar." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "That's where we hit next." Marcus hesitated. "Naomi, you're walking into a lion's den. If Langley's using that warehouse to cover his tracks, it won't be unguarded." "I don't care," Naomi said, her voice steely. "I'm not letting him get away with this." That evening, Naomi returned to her apartment, exhausted but resolute. Daniel was sitting at the dining table, a pencil in his hand and a piece of paper in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting up with a smile. "Naomi," he said, running over to her. She crouched down to hug him, her arms wrapping protectively around his small frame. "Hey, buddy. How was your day?" "Lissa let me draw," he said, holding up the paper. It was a crayon sketch of a house with a tree and two stick figures, one tall, one small. Naomi's heart twisted as she looked at the drawing. "Is that us?" Daniel nodded. "I made it for you." "Thank you," Naomi said softly, her throat tightening. "It's beautiful." Daniel's eyes flickered with hesitation. "Naomi, are the bad people still out there?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Yes, they are. But I'm going to stop them. I promise you." Daniel nodded, his small hand reaching out to clutch hers. "I believe you." The next morning, Naomi and Marcus parked outside the warehouse listed under Langley Solutions. The building was nondescript, a hulking structure of concrete and steel in an industrial district on the outskirts of the city. "Looks quiet," Marcus said, scanning the area. "Too quiet," Naomi muttered, her eyes narrowing. She adjusted the holster at her hip and checked her radio. "We go in, assess the situation, and get out. We're not here to start a war." Marcus nodded, though the tension in his jaw was evident. "Got it." They approached the warehouse cautiously, their steps silent on the gravel. Naomi tried the main door, but it was locked. Marcus gestured toward a side entrance, and they slipped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of dust and oil. Rows of shelves stretched into the shadows, stacked with crates and unmarked boxes. Naomi's instincts were on high alert. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was waiting for them. "Check the crates," she whispered to Marcus. "Look for anything that ties this to bright futures." Marcus nodded and began prying open a nearby box. Naomi moved further into the warehouse, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She froze when her beam landed on a row of file cabinets tucked into a corner. Her heart pounded as she approached, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled open the first drawer. Inside were folders, dozens of them, labeled with names and dates. Naomi's breath caught as she scanned the files. They were records of children, medical histories, adoption papers, and falsified birth certificates. "This is it," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This is the proof we need." "Naomi," Marcus's voice hissed from across the room. She turned to see him holding up a document. "These crates, they're full of blank birth certificates and adoption forms. They were fabricating everything." Before Naomi could respond, The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. "Move," she whispered urgently, ducking behind a row of shelves. Marcus followed, the files in his hands as they pressed themselves against the cold metal. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices. Naomi peeked through a gap in the shelves, her breath catching when she saw the figures. 3 men, armed and alert, were making their way through the warehouse. One of them stopped near the file cabinets, his eyes scanning the area. "Boss said to check everything," he said, his voice sharp. "Make sure nothing's been touched." Naomi's pulse raced. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. She signaled to Marcus, pointing toward a back exit. He nodded, clutching the files tightly as they began to move silently through the shadows. The men were distracted, their focus on the files, giving Naomi and Marcus the opening they needed. They slipped out of the warehouse and into the night, their breaths heavy with adrenaline. Back in the car, Naomi clutched the files to her chest, her hands trembling. "We got it," she said, her voice filled with both relief and determination. "We have what we need." Marcus nodded, though his face was grim. "This isn't over, Naomi. Langley won't let this go. He'll come after you, and Daniel." Naomi's jaw tightened. "Let him try. I'll be ready." Later that night, Naomi sat at her dining table, the files spread out before her. She sifted through them, her anger growing with each revelation. Names, dates, payments, it was all there, laid out in black and white. Bright Futures hadn't just stolen children. They had built an empire on the pain and suffering of countless families. As Naomi worked, Daniel approached her, his small hand clutching the crayon drawing he had made earlier. "Naomi?" he said softly. She looked up, her expression softening. "What is it, buddy? Are we going to be okay?" he asked, his voice filled with worry. Naomi reached out, pulling him into her lap. "Yes," she said firmly. "We're going to be okay. I promise." Daniel rested his head against her shoulder, his small body warm and fragile in her arms. Naomi held him tightly, her resolve stronger than ever. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to stop until Bright Futures was destroyed, and Daniel was safe. Justice for the forgotten. The morning sun rose over the city, casting golden streaks across Naomi's apartment walls. She stood at her dining table, the files from Langley's warehouse spread out like puzzle pieces waiting to be solved. Each document told a story of a child stolen, a family broken, and a system corrupted beyond belief. Daniel sat nearby, drawing quietly, but his gaze kept darting toward Naomi, as though sensing the weight of what she was carrying. He hadn't asked many questions since the night at the warehouse, but Naomi could see the worry in his eyes. She crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Daniel," she said softly, "I'm going to make this right. For you. For all the other kids Bright Futures hurt. Do you believe me?" Daniel nodded, his small hand reaching out to clasp hers. "I do." Naomi smiled, but her resolve was like steel. Today, she would take the fight to Richard Langley. At the precinct, Marcus was waiting for her in the conference room, a fresh pot of coffee steaming beside him. The files they had retrieved were spread out on the table, alongside printouts of Langley's financial records and connections. Lisa Grant had joined them, her expression grim but determined. "This is everything we need to take him down," Marcus said, gesturing to the evidence. "The financial trails, the forged documents, the testimonies from Corbett and Carla. It's all here." Lisa nodded, her arms crossed. "But it won't be easy. Langley's connections run deep. He'll have lawyers, politicians, maybe even cops on his payroll. We need to hit him hard and fast before he has a chance to cover his tracks." Naomi leaned over the table, her finger tracing a line on one of the maps Marcus had printed. "Langley's consulting firm isn't just a front. It's a hub. If we can raid the warehouse and the offices at the same time, we'll catch them off guard." Marcus hesitated. "That's going to take a lot of manpower, Naomi. We'll need to loop in the higher-ups. And you know how risky that is." Naomi's jaw tightened. She knew exactly what Marcus meant. The corruption within Bright Futures had extended to law enforcement in the past. If even one person in the precinct was still connected to Langley, the entire operation could be compromised. "Then we keep this quiet," Naomi said firmly. "We only bring in people we trust. A small team, fast and focused." Lisa frowned. "You're taking a big risk, Naomi." "I don't care," Naomi replied, her voice steady. "This ends today." By mid-afternoon, the team was assembled. 5 officers Naomi trusted implicitly, along with Marcus and Lisa. They reviewed the plan in detail. One team would raid Langley Solutions' main office, while another would hit the warehouse. Marcus would stay at the precinct, coordinating from behind the scenes, while Naomi led the charge at the office. Before they left, Naomi took Lisa aside. "I need you to keep an eye on Daniel while we're out," she said. "I can't risk him being anywhere near this." Lisa nodded. "Of course. I'll take him back to my place. He'll be safe." Naomi knelt down to Daniel's level, her heart twisting as she saw the worry in his eyes. "I'll be back soon, okay?" she said, her voice gentle. "Are you going to stop the bad man?" Daniel asked. "Yes," Naomi said firmly. "And when this is over, you'll never have to worry about him again. I promise." The sun was beginning to set as Naomi's team pulled up outside Langley Solutions. The sleek, glass-fronted building looked unassuming, but Naomi knew better. Inside, Langley's empire was unraveling. Naomi's radio crackled as Marcus's voice came through. "The warehouse team is in position. They're waiting for your signal." "Copy that," Naomi replied, her voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. She turned to her team, her eyes sharp. "Let's move." They entered the building quickly and quietly, their boots echoing softly on the polished floors. The reception area was empty, the air thick with the hum of computers and faint chatter from the offices beyond. Naomi led the way, her hand hovering near her holstered weapon, as they moved deeper into the building. They'd reached the main office, where the sound of typing and muffled voices grew louder. "Go," Naomi whispered, and her team sprang into action. The doors burst open, and the room erupted into chaos. Employees froze, their eyes wide with fear as officers shouted orders. Naomi's gaze locked onto the man at the center of the room, Richard Langley. He was exactly as she had imagined, tall, sharply dressed, and radiating an air of arrogance. But as their eyes met, Naomi saw a flicker of something else. Recognition. "Naomi Bennett," Langley said, his voice calm but laced with disdain. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Hands where I can see them," Naomi snapped, her weapon trained on him. Langley raised his hands slowly, his smirk never faltering. "Do you really think this changes anything? Arrest me, and you'll barely scratch the surface of what I've built." "Maybe," Naomi said, her voice cold. "But it's a start." Behind her, the team was securing the office, collecting documents and seizing computers. Langley remained calm, even as officers cuffed his hands behind his back. "You're making a mistake," he said as they led him out of the building. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Naomi stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "You stole my son," she said, her voice low but filled with fury. "And I'm going to make sure you pay for it." For the first time, Langley's smirk faltered. Back at the precinct, the evidence from the raid poured in. Documents, hard drives, and testimonies from employees who were all too eager to turn on Langley in exchange for leniency. Marcus worked tirelessly, piecing together the final puzzle. "We've got enough to bury him," he said, his voice triumphant. "Corbett's testimony, Carla's journal, and now this. Langley's empire is done." Naomi nodded, though her mind was already on the next step. What about the others? The people who helped him? "We'll get them," Marcus promised, one by one. That evening, Naomi returned to Lisa's house to pick up Daniel. When he saw her, his face lit up, and he ran into her arms. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice muffled against her shoulder. Naomi held him tightly, her throat tightening. "It's over," she said softly. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace, a fragile, tentative hope that things might finally be okay. A week later, Naomi stood in a courtroom, watching as Richard Langley was sentenced to life in prison. The evidence against him had been overwhelming, and the judge had shown no mercy. As she left the courthouse, Daniel's small hand slipped into hers. She looked down at him, her heart swelling with love and determination. "Are we safe now?" he asked. "Yes," Naomi said, her voice steady. "We're safe." And for the first time in years, she believed it.